Hello there, you're listening to The Planet's Memory, where time breathes and the Earth remembers. Close your eyes and imagine standing in a museum hall where ancient bones tower above you like cathedral columns reaching toward forgotten heavens. The dim lights cast long shadows across reconstructed skeletons that seem to breathe with silent memory. Tonight we invite you on a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the stones beneath your feet and the fragments of time locked within them. What if the fossils we have carefully labelled and catalogued are not merely the remains of creatures long departed from this world? What if these ancient forms were never truly alive in the way we imagine? What if instead they were vessels, shells and containers for something far stranger and more profound? What if the beings we call dinosaurs and ancient mammals were not the masters of their own existence, but were themselves controlled by forces we have never properly recognized or understood? This is a story that begins in darkness, in the deep places of the earth where time moves differently and where the boundary between the living and the unliving becomes thin as morning mist. It is a story whispered by stones and told in the language of minerals and buried bone. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let us explore together a possibility that science has overlooked and imagination has only begun to touch. Let us ask the question that changes everything about our past, and perhaps our future as well. The evening air is cool and still, as we begin this exploration into mysteries that have waited millions of years for someone to ask the right questions. The world of paleontology has always operated on certain assumptions that seem so obvious they are rarely questioned. We find bones in the ground, we study their shapes and structures, we measure and calculate and reconstruct, and we declare with confidence that we understand what these creatures were and how they lived. But what if our confidence has blinded us to deeper truths? What if the fossil record is not what it appears to be? The story we are about to unfold will take us through layers of earth and layers of understanding, peeling back assumptions one by one until we arrive at a place where nothing is quite as simple as it seemed. This journey requires patience and an openness to possibilities that may feel uncomfortable at first. It asks us to reconsider not just ancient life, but the very nature of consciousness, control, and what it means to be alive. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow your mind to wander through corridors of time, where the impossible becomes merely unlikely, and where unlikely things turn out to be true. The story truly begins not in a laboratory or a lecture hall, but in the quiet moment when a paleontologist holds a fossil and feels something unexplainable. There have been countless such moments throughout the history of fossil study, though few have spoken openly about them. A researcher working late into the night, alone with specimens that have been dead for millions of years, sometimes reports a sensation that defies easy description. It is not quite a sound and not quite a feeling, but something between the two. Some have described it as a presence, others as a kind of attention that seems to come from the fossil itself. These moments are usually dismissed as fatigue or imagination, but they happen too often and to too many serious scientists to be entirely ignored. One such researcher was a woman named Margaret Chen, who worked in the basement collections of a natural history museum in the American Midwest during the 1980s. She spent her days cataloguing fossils that had been collected decades earlier and never properly studied. Most were fragments, pieces of bone that could barely be identified, but Margaret treated each one with careful respect. She would clean them gently, measure them precisely, photograph them from multiple angles, and record every detail in her careful handwriting. The work was quiet and repetitive, the kind of task that allows the mind to wander while the hands stay busy. It was during one of these long afternoons that Margaret first noticed something strange about a particular fossil. It was a segment of rib bone from a creature that had lived perhaps 70 million years ago, a dinosaur whose species had never been fully determined. The bone was unremarkable in most ways, showing the typical mineralization and structural features she had seen in hundreds of similar specimens. But when she held it up to examine a crack along its surface, she felt a sudden wave of vertigo, as if the ground beneath her had shifted slightly. She set the bone down quickly and stepped back, her heart beating faster than it should. The sensation passed almost immediately, but it left her unsettled. She told herself it was just tiredness or perhaps hunger, but when she picked up the bone again an hour later, the same feeling returned, stronger this time. It was as if something was watching her through the bone, or perhaps from within it. Margaret was not a superstitious person, and she did not believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. She was a scientist, trained to observe and record facts. But facts sometimes include experiences that do not fit into existing theories. She decided to conduct an experiment. Over the following weeks, she handled the rib bone repeatedly, always noting her physical and emotional state beforehand and her sensations during and after contact with the fossil. The pattern was consistent. Every time she held this particular bone, she felt that same odd sensation of presence and attention. Other fossils from the same site did not produce the effect. Other bones from the same type of dinosaur did not produce it either. There was something specific about this one fragment that was different. Margaret began to research similar reports in the scientific literature, but she found almost nothing. Paleontologists did not write about feelings or presences. They wrote about measurements and classifications and evolutionary relationships. But she did find a few obscure references in older texts, journal entries from 19th century fossil hunters who sometimes mentioned unusual experiences around certain specimens. These accounts were always brief and usually included an apologetic tone, as if the writers knew they were straying into territory that would not be taken seriously. One account from 1873 described a collector in England who claimed that a particular ammonite fossil gave him vivid dreams whenever he kept it in his bedroom. Another from 1912 mentioned a museum curator in France who insisted that certain fossil fish seemed to move slightly when no one was looking directly at them. These stories had been dismissed as eccentricity or exaggeration, but Margaret began to wonder if they represented something real that science had simply refused to acknowledge. She started visiting other museums and private collections, always looking for opportunities to handle a wide variety of fossils. She developed a quiet reputation as someone unusually dedicated to tactile examination of specimens. Most of her colleagues saw this as simply thoroughness, but Margaret was conducting a secret survey. She wanted to know how common these strange sensations really were. Over the course of 5 years, she handled thousands of fossils. Most produced no unusual effects whatsoever, but approximately 1 in every 200 gave her that same feeling of presence and attention. The ratio was consistent across different types of fossils, different time periods, and different locations. Something was there in a small percentage of fossils that was not there in the others. Margaret never published her findings in any official capacity. She knew that doing so would likely end her career and mark her as unreliable. But she kept detailed private notes, and she began to develop a theory that would have seemed absurd to her colleagues. What if fossils were not simply dead remains? What if some of them contained something that persisted, something that could be felt even across millions of years? And if that were true, what exactly was that something? Was it a trace of the original life force of the creature? Or was it something else entirely? Something that had inhabited the creature while it lived and remained somehow present in its mineralized bones. Margaret died in 2003 without ever sharing her full research with the world, but her private notebooks, discovered by a niece who was going through her belongings, eventually found their way to other researchers who were asking similar questions. These notebooks would become one of the foundation stones for a new way of thinking about fossils and the creatures they represented. They suggested that the relationship between a fossil and the living being it once was might be more complex and more strange than anyone had imagined. They hinted at the possibility that we have been looking at the fossil record backward, seeing the shadows instead of the substance, mistaking the controlled for the controllers. To understand the theory that fossils might represent something other than simple dead animals, we must first consider the strange architecture of prehistoric life. When we look at dinosaur skeletons mounted in museums, we see shapes that seem familiar in their basic structure but alien in their proportions and details. We see massive bodies supported by legs that seem too thin, heads that seem too small or too large, necks that extend to impossible lengths. We are told that evolution shaped these forms through natural selection, adapting each species to its environment and lifestyle. But what if we have been missing something fundamental about how these bodies actually functioned? What if the physical forms we reconstruct from fossils were never meant to operate independently? What if they were always designed to be controlled by something else? Something that left no fossil record of its own? This possibility requires us to think differently about the relationship between form and function in ancient life. It asks us to consider whether the bodies we find preserved in stone might have been biological machines rather than autonomous creatures. The idea seems strange at first, but it becomes less so when we examine certain peculiarities in the fossil record that have never been fully explained. Consider the case of the sauropod dinosaurs, those enormous long-necked herbivores that dominated many landscapes during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. These animals reached sizes that pushed the limits of what we think biology can achieve. The largest known sauropods weighed as much as 70 or 80 tons, with necks that could stretch 40 feet or more. The engineering challenges of such a body plan are immense. How did blood circulate to a head held so far above the heart? How did the skeleton support such weight without collapsing? How did these creatures consume enough food to fuel their massive bodies when their heads were relatively small and their mouths could only process vegetation at a limited rate? Scientists have proposed various solutions to these problems, including multiple hearts, air sacs that reduce body weight, and highly efficient digestive systems. But all of these explanations require us to imagine biological innovations for which we have no direct evidence. The fossils show us the bones, but not the soft tissues where such innovations would have existed. What if there is another explanation? One that does not require us to imagine impossible biology? What if sauropods were able to reach such enormous sizes precisely because they were not operating their own bodies? Consider how much simpler the engineering becomes if we imagine that the sauropod body was being controlled and regulated by an intelligence that was not physically part of the body itself. Such an intelligence could manage circulation, digestion, movement, and all other bodily functions with a precision that would be impossible for a biological brain located inside the body. The brain case of a sauropod is famously small, often compared to the size of a walnut in creatures that weighed many tons. This has always seemed like a puzzle. How could such a small brain operate such a large body? The usual answer is that sauropods did not need much intelligence because their lifestyle was simple, consisting mainly of eating and walking. But this answer has never been entirely satisfying. Operating a body of that size and complexity, even for simple tasks, requires enormous amounts of information processing. Every step must be coordinated across multiple massive legs. Every swing of that long neck must be balanced against the body's center of gravity. Every heartbeat must be timed and calibrated to push blood through a circulatory system that stretches across dozens of feet. A walnut-sized brain seems inadequate for these tasks, yet the sauropods thrived for millions of years. But what if that small brain was never meant to handle all of these tasks alone? What if it was merely an interface, a receiving station that took instructions from somewhere else and translated them into physical actions? In this model, the sauropod body becomes something more like a remotely operated vehicle than an autonomous organism. The true intelligence, the real master, would exist somewhere outside the body, communicating with it through means we do not yet understand. This might sound like science fiction, but it is worth noting that nature has already demonstrated similar relationships in various forms. Consider the relationship between a hermit crab and its borrowed shell. The crab's soft body is vulnerable and would not survive long without protection. The shell it inhabits was grown by another creature entirely, but the crab uses it as if it were its own body. The shell does not live, but it is essential to the crab's survival and becomes part of its functional anatomy. Now imagine this relationship taken to a much more sophisticated level. Imagine an intelligence that can inhabit and operate a biological body the way a hermit crab inhabits a shell, but with complete control over all functions. The body grows according to patterns encoded in its own biological material, but it is always meant to be operated by something else. It is never truly autonomous. This is the possibility we must consider when we look at the strange proportions and seemingly impossible biology of many prehistoric creatures. The fossil record contains numerous examples of body plans that seem poorly designed for independent operation, but might make perfect sense as controlled vessels. Consider the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles of the Mesozoic era. Some species of pterosaur achieved wingspans of more than 30 feet, making them the largest flying creatures ever known to have existed. The physics of flight at such scales presents enormous challenges. The wings must be strong enough to support the body's weight, yet light enough to be moved rapidly through the air. The creature must be able to launch itself into flight, control its direction and speed while airborne, and land safely despite its size and momentum. Birds achieve flight through a combination of powerful muscles, hollow bones, and highly specialized feathers. Pterosaurs had none of these advantages. Their wings were made of skin stretched across elongated finger bones. Their bones were thin-walled but not as hollow as bird bones. Their muscles, based on the attachment points visible in fossils, do not seem large enough to power flight in an animal of such size. Yet they flew, and they flew well enough to dominate the skies for more than 100 million years. How did they manage this? The standard explanation invokes various structural adaptations and flight techniques that might have made large pterosaur flight possible despite the challenges. But these explanations often feel incomplete, requiring us to imagine that pterosaurs were operating right at the edge of physical possibility, with almost no margin for error. What if instead we consider that pterosaur flight was possible because the intelligence directing it existed outside the physical constraints of the body? An external controller would not be limited by reaction times based on nerve impulses traveling through biological tissue. It could adjust wing angles and body position continuously and instantly, compensating for wind gusts and turbulence in ways that a biological brain could never match. The pterosaur body would still need to be physically capable of flight, but it would not need to be capable of autonomous flight. It would only need to be a functional platform for an intelligence that could operate it with superhuman precision. In this model, the pterosaur becomes something like a glider being flown by an expert pilot. The glider itself has no intelligence and no ability to fly on its own, but in the hands of a skilled operator it can perform maneuvers that seem to defy physics. This same principle might apply to many of the most extreme and specialized forms in the fossil record. The ankylosaurs with their heavy armor plating and club-like tails, the ceratopsians with their elaborate horns and frills, the theropods with their tiny arms and massive jaws. All of these body plans have features that seem oddly exaggerated or strangely limited when we imagine them as autonomous creatures. But if we think of them as specialized tools designed for particular purposes and operated by external intelligences, their forms begin to make more sense. The ankylosaur becomes a mobile fortress. its body shaped purely for defense with little regard for speed or comfort, because the controlling intelligence does not experience discomfort and does not reside inside the vulnerable body. The ceratopsian becomes a living battering ram and display platform, its horns and frills serving functions that matter more to the controller than to any biological creature. The theropod becomes an efficient predation machine, its body stripped down to only what is needed for running and biting, because the intelligence directing it requires nothing more. Each of these forms represents not an evolutionary compromise between competing needs, but a purpose-built design created for a specific role. They are tools, instruments, vehicles for intelligences that shaped them for particular uses. One of the strongest arguments against any unconventional theory about prehistoric life is the lack of direct evidence in the fossil record. If dinosaurs and other ancient creatures were being controlled by external intelligences, where are the fossils of those controllers? Where are the structures or organs that would have allowed such control? Why do we find no trace of this supposed master intelligence in the millions of fossils that have been discovered and studied? These are reasonable questions, and they deserve careful consideration. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but neither can we simply ignore the fact that nothing in the fossil record clearly points to the existence of controlling intelligences separate from the bodies they supposedly operated. However, when we examine this objection more closely, we find that it may not be as conclusive as it first appears. The fossil record is famous for what it does not preserve as well as for what it does. Soft tissues rarely fossilize. Behavior leaves no direct trace. Entire ecosystems can vanish without leaving enough evidence for us to reconstruct them with confidence. The absence of fossilized controllers might simply mean that these intelligences were not the kind of thing that could fossilize. Consider what we know about fossilization and what kinds of materials and structures can be preserved over millions of years. Fossilization generally requires hard tissues like bones, teeth, or shells. It requires specific burial conditions that protect remains from decay and scavenging. It requires geological stability over immense periods of time. Most living things never fossilize at all. They die and decay completely, returning their substance to the environment without leaving any permanent record. Even among creatures with hard tissues, only a tiny fraction ever become fossils. We estimate that far less than 1% of all the individual organisms that have ever lived are preserved as fossils. Most species that have existed are unknown to us because they left no fossils we have found, or because they left no fossils at all. Given this reality, the absence of fossilized controllers tells us very little. If the controlling intelligences were composed of soft tissue, they would almost never fossilize. If they were small, they would be even less likely to be preserved and recognized. If they were rare compared to the bodies they controlled, we might never encounter their fossils even if some did exist. And if they were not biological in nature at all, they would leave no fossils under any circumstances. This last possibility is worth exploring further. We tend to assume that intelligence requires biology, that thinking and consciousness can only emerge from systems of neurons and brain cells like those we find in animals. But this assumption is based on a sample size of one, the single example of Earth life as we know it. We have no way of knowing whether intelligence might exist in other forms, using other substrates and other mechanisms. Science fiction has long explored the possibility of energy-based life forms, creatures made of plasma or electromagnetic fields that could think and act without any solid body at all. Such beings would leave no fossils. They would be invisible to most of our detection methods. They could potentially exist alongside biological life without being noticed until someone thought to look for them in the right way. If the controllers of prehistoric bodies were something like this, if they were made of organized energy rather than organized matter, they could have been completely present in the ancient world while remaining completely absent from the fossil record. They would be the ultimate hidden masters, shaping the course of biological history while leaving no trace of their own existence in stone. But even if we set aside such exotic possibilities and assume that controllers would have to be biological and therefore potentially fossilizable, there are still good reasons why we might not have recognized their remains. The history of paleontology is full of examples of fossils that were misidentified or misunderstood for decades or even centuries. The first dinosaur fossils discovered were thought to be the bones of giant humans or of biblical monsters. Flying reptile fossils were initially classified as swimming creatures. Countless fossils have been sitting in museum drawers, labelled as one thing, only to be re-examined years later and discovered to be something entirely different. If control of fossils exist, they might already be in our collections, but we have not recognized them for what they are, because we are not looking for them and would not know what they should look like. We might have classified them as unusual examples of known animals, or as fragments too incomplete to identify. We might have set them aside as oddities that do not fit our existing frameworks. Without a clear search image of what we are looking for, we could easily overlook the very evidence we need. There is also the possibility that controllers did leave traces in the fossil record, but that these traces are subtle and require a different kind of analysis to detect. Modern forensic science has shown us that evidence of one organism's interaction with another can persist in unexpected ways. Parasites leave marks on the bones of their hosts. Diseases alter the structure of tissue in recognizable patterns. Chemical analysis can detect the presence of substances that would never be visible to the naked eye. Perhaps controllers left similar subtle traces, chemical signatures or structural anomalies in the fossils of the bodies they operated. Several researchers have begun to investigate this possibility, conducting detailed chemical analyses of fossils that might reveal the presence of unusual compounds or unexpected isotope ratios that could indicate external influence or control. The work is still in its early stages, but some preliminary results have been intriguing. Certain fossils show trace elements concentrated in the brain cavity and along the spinal column in patterns that do not match what we would expect from natural mineralization or contamination. These patterns are rare, appearing in perhaps one in every few hundred specimens examined, but they are consistent when they do appear. The concentrations are too regular to be random and too specific to be easily explained by geological processes. One research team led by a geochemist named David Winters has been studying these anomalies for more than a decade. David became interested in the question almost by accident while analyzing fossils for an unrelated study on ancient environments. He noticed that certain specimens contained traces of rare earth elements in configurations that seemed almost artificial, as if something had deposited these elements in specific locations for specific purposes. Rare earth elements are naturally occurring metals that are found in small quantities throughout the Earth's crust, but they typically distribute themselves randomly in fossils according to the chemistry of the surrounding rock. The patterns David was seeing were not random. They formed lines and clusters that suggested organization and intention. When he mapped the distribution of these elements in 3 dimensions, he found that they tended to concentrate along what would have been the major nerve pathways of the living animal, with the highest concentrations in the brain cavity and at junction points where multiple nerves would have met. This distribution pattern did not match any known geological or biological process. It looked less like contamination and more like circuitry, as if something had laid down pathways of conductive material throughout the nervous system of the creature. David published his initial findings in a respected geology journal, carefully avoiding any speculation about what might have caused the patterns he observed. The paper attracted little attention at first, dismissed by most readers as an interesting curiosity with no clear implications. But a few other researchers began to conduct similar analyses on their own fossil collections, and some of them found the same patterns in certain specimens. Not in all fossils, not even in most, but in that same small percentage that seemed to appear consistently across different studies. The specimens that showed these unusual trace element patterns were not clustered in any particular time period or geographical location. They appeared throughout the fossil record from the Cambrian period more than 500 million years ago to the Pleistocene epoch just a few thousand years ago. They showed up in dinosaurs and in mammals, in marine reptiles and in birds, in creatures from every major group and every era of life on Earth. The only common factor was the pattern itself, those organized lines and clusters of rare Earth elements that seemed to map onto nervous system structures. David and his colleagues began to call these specimens marked fossils, though they remained uncertain about what the markings actually represented. Were they evidence of external control systems that had interfaced with ancient nervous systems? Were they the fossil traces of the controllers themselves? Or were they something else entirely, some natural phenomenon that only looked artificial because we did not yet understand its cause? If we are to seriously consider the possibility that ancient life forms were controlled by external intelligences, we must address one of the most significant events in the history of life on Earth. The Cambrian explosion, which occurred approximately 540 million years ago, represents a period of rapid diversification when most major animal groups first appeared in the fossil record. Before the Cambrian period, life on Earth was simple, consisting mainly of single-celled organisms and some basic multicellular forms. Then, in a geological instant, complex animals with hard shells, jointed legs, sophisticated eyes, and specialized organs appeared in tremendous variety. The suddenness of this transformation has puzzled biologists since it was first recognized. Evolution typically works slowly, through gradual changes over immense periods of time. The Cambrian explosion seems to violate this pattern, showing innovation and diversification happening at a pace that seems almost impossible under standard evolutionary theory. Many explanations have been proposed for this rapid diversification, including environmental changes, genetic innovations, and ecological feedback loops. But what if the Cambrian explosion was not primarily a biological event at all? What if it represents the moment when external controllers first began to shape life on Earth in significant numbers? Imagine that before the Cambrian period, life existed in its simple forms, evolving slowly according to the standard rules of natural selection and genetic mutation. Then something new arrived, or awakened, or emerged. These controlling intelligences, whatever their nature, discovered that they could interact with biological organisms, influencing their development and directing their behavior. At first, the organisms they could work with were simple, offering limited possibilities. But the controllers learned and experimented, gradually developing techniques for shaping biological forms to serve as more sophisticated vessels. As their skills improved, they began to create or guide the development of more complex body plans. They needed sensory organs, so eyes evolved with startling rapidity. They needed mobility, so jointed appendages appeared. They needed protection, so shells and armor developed. Each innovation made the biological vessels more useful to the controllers, and each success encouraged further experimentation. The result was an explosion of new forms, not driven primarily by competition between organisms for resources, but by the creative exploration of possibilities by intelligences using biological material as their medium. The diversity of the Cambrian fauna, with its strange and often short-lived experimental forms, makes more sense in this light. These were not all successful adaptations to environmental niches, but rather prototypes and trials, some of which worked well and some of which did not. This interpretation of the Cambrian explosion also helps explain certain oddities in the fossil record from that period. Many Cambrian creatures have body plans that never appeared again in the history of life. They seem to represent evolutionary dead ends, experiments that were tried once and abandoned. Traditional evolution can account for this through extinction and contingency, but it requires us to believe that all of these unusual forms were somehow less fit than the designs that ultimately prevailed. Yet many of them seem perfectly functional based on what we can determine from their fossils. They were not obviously inferior. They simply disappeared while other forms continued and diversified. If we think of them as early prototypes in a process of deliberate design and experimentation, their brief existence becomes easier to understand. They were not failed adaptations, but discarded drafts, body plans, that served their purpose for a time but were ultimately superseded by improved designs. The controllers were learning what worked and what did not, what kinds of bodies were most useful for their purposes, and what kinds were too limited or too difficult to operate effectively. One of the most famous Cambrian creatures is Anomalocaris, a predator that could grow to more than 3 feet in length, making it a giant by the standards of its time. Anomalocaris had a circular mouth surrounded by plates that could close like a camera shutter, large compound eyes on stalks, and a segmented body with fin-like flaps along its sides. It was unlike anything that came before it and unlike most things that came after. For decades, paleontologists were not even certain how to classify it. Its body parts were so unusual that when they were first discovered, they were thought to be fragments from several different animals. Only when complete specimens were found did it become clear that all of these strange parts belonged to a single creature. Anomalocaris dominated the Cambrian oceans for millions of years, and then vanished completely from the fossil record. No direct descendants survived. It was an evolutionary experiment that ended, successful in its time, but ultimately replaced by other designs. Or, in the alternative interpretation we are exploring, it was a body plan that served the controllers for a specific period and purpose, but was eventually retired in favour of more refined forms. The Cambrian period also saw the first appearance of vertebrates, the group that would eventually lead to fish, amphibians, reptiles and mammals. The earliest vertebrates were small, simple creatures that looked somewhat like modern lancelets, with a notochord providing structural support but no true backbone or complex brain. Over the following millions of years, vertebrates became more sophisticated, developing true vertebrae, jaws, paired fins, and increasingly complex nervous systems. This progression from simple to complex seems to follow a logical pattern of gradual improvement, but it is worth noting that each major innovation in vertebrate anatomy made these creatures more suitable as vehicles for external control. A more complex nervous system means more sophisticated movement and behavior. Better sensory organs mean more information about the environment. Paired fins and later legs mean greater mobility and more options for interaction with the physical world. If controllers were guiding vertebrate evolution, they would naturally push in the direction of creating bodies that were more capable and more useful to them. The result would look exactly like what we see in the fossil record, a steady increase in capability and complexity that we have always attributed to natural selection, but that might actually reflect deliberate design. As life diversified after the Cambrian explosion, certain patterns emerged that become more interesting when viewed through the lens of possible external control. Different groups of organisms developed along different lines, specializing in different environments and lifestyles. Fish evolved to dominate the oceans, developing streamlined bodies, powerful tails, and keen senses adapted to underwater life. Some eventually transitioned to land, becoming amphibians and then reptiles. Insects took a different path, developing exoskeletons, compound eyes, and flight, long before any vertebrate managed to leave the ground. Each major group of animals represents a different solution to the challenges of survival, and each developed its own characteristic body plan and nervous system organization. But beneath this diversity, there are underlying similarities in how these different groups are organized and how their bodies function. All complex animals have some form of centralized nervous system that coordinates their movements and processes sensory information. All have similar basic body plans with bilateral symmetry, a front end where sensory organs concentrate, and a back end that produces locomotion. These similarities are usually explained as the result of common ancestry, but they might also reflect common requirements for effective control. If external intelligences were operating animal bodies, They would need certain features to be present regardless of what type of animal they were working with. They would need a nervous system that could receive and transmit signals. They would need sensory organs that could gather information about the environment. They would need muscles and limbs or other structures that could produce movement and manipulation. They would benefit from a body plan that organized these elements in a consistent and predictable way. The fact that most animals do share these basic features might not be entirely due to common descent. It might also reflect the fact that these features are necessary for the kind of interaction that controllers require. An intelligence trying to operate a biological body would naturally prefer a body that had all of its control systems organized in a standard way. Much like a person learning to drive can transition between different cars because they all have steering wheels, pedals, and gear shifts in roughly the same positions, a controller that learned to operate one type of body would be able to transfer those skills more easily to other body types if they shared common organizational principles. This might explain why certain body plans have been remarkably stable over evolutionary time, while others have changed dramatically. The basic organization of vertebrate bodies, for example, has remained essentially unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals all share the same fundamental structure with a vertebral column, a skull, four limbs, or the evolved remnants of four limbs, and major organs arranged in consistent positions. The details vary enormously, but the underlying pattern is constant. This stability is sometimes explained by saying that major changes to fundamental body plans are usually fatal and therefore never survive to be passed on. But if bodies are being designed and operated by external controllers, there is another explanation. The standard vertebrate body plan works well for the purposes of control. It has been refined over hundreds of millions of years to the point where it represents an optimal solution for a wide range of environments and activities. Controllers would have little reason to deviate from this successful template except when adapting to very specialized circumstances. The result would be exactly what we observe: endless variation in surface features and proportions, but deep conservatism in underlying organization. Certain periods in Earth's history show dramatic shifts in which groups of animals dominated and which body plans were most common. The end of the Permian period, approximately 250 million years ago, saw the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history. More than 90% of all species disappeared in a geological instant. The causes of this extinction are still debated, but the effects are clear. The world that emerged after the Permian extinction was fundamentally different from the world that came before. Mammal-like reptiles that had dominated the Permian landscapes were replaced by new groups of reptiles that would eventually lead to dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and marine reptiles. This was not just a changing of the guard, but a complete restructuring of terrestrial ecosystems. The body plans and lifestyles that had been successful for millions of years suddenly became rare or disappeared entirely, while new forms that had been minor players suddenly flourished and diversified. Traditional explanations focus on environmental changes and ecological opportunities. The extinction eliminated dominant groups and freed up resources and niches that allowed other groups to expand. But if we consider the possibility of external control, another factor might have been at work. What if the Permian extinction was not just an environmental catastrophe, but also a changing of controllers? Imagine that different groups of controlling intelligences had specialized in operating different types of bodies. Some controllers preferred the mammal-like reptiles that had been dominant in the Permian. Others had been experimenting with the archosaur lineage that would lead to dinosaurs, but had not yet achieved dominance because the mammal-like forms were occupying most available niches. When the Permian extinction occurred, it killed bodies indiscriminately based on their biological vulnerabilities, but the controllers themselves, if they were not biological, would have survived. The controllers that had specialized in mammal-like bodies suddenly found themselves with far fewer suitable vessels available. Meanwhile, the controllers that had been working with early archosaurs found opportunities to expand. They guided the evolution of their preferred body types, helping them adapt and diversify to fill the empty niches left by the extinction. The result was the rise of the dinosaurs, not because they were inherently superior to what came before, but because the balance of power among controllers had shifted. This same pattern might explain other major transitions in the history of life. Each mass extinction, each major turnover in dominant groups, might reflect not just environmental change, but shifts in which controllers were most active and which body plans they favoured. The rise and persistence of dinosaurs is itself worthy of careful consideration in this context. For more than 160 million years, dinosaurs were the dominant large land animals on Earth. No other group has maintained such dominance for such an extended period. During this vast span of time, dinosaurs evolved into an incredible variety of forms, from chicken-sized predators to multi-ton herbivores, from swift runners to armored tanks, from ground dwellers to creatures that spent much of their lives in trees or in water. Yet through all of this diversity, they remained recognizably dinosaurs, sharing common features of skeletal structure, posture, and reproduction. The longevity and success of the dinosaur body plan suggests that it was extremely well suited to something, but it is not entirely clear to what. Dinosaurs were not obviously more efficient than mammals at processing food, or more intelligent than the mammal-like reptiles they replaced. They did have some advantages, including more efficient respiration and more upright posture, but these advantages do not seem sufficient to explain 160 million years of dominance. Unless, of course, the dominance was not entirely about biological efficiency. If controllers preferred dinosaur bodies because they were easier to operate or more versatile as vehicles, then the long reign of the dinosaurs becomes more understandable. They persisted not because they were the best adapted organisms in a purely biological sense, but because they were the preferred tools of the intelligences that mattered most. When we examine mass extinction events in Earth's history, certain mathematical patterns emerge that are difficult to explain through purely random or environmental causes. Extinction rates are not evenly distributed across time or across different groups of organisms. Instead, they cluster in specific periods and affect some groups far more severely than others. The 5 major mass extinctions recognized by paleontologists each eliminated a large percentage of existing species in relatively short time frames, but the patterns of which species survived and which perished do not always follow the logic we would expect from environmental catastrophes alone. Some groups that seem poorly adapted to changed conditions survived, while others that seem more capable went extinct. Some ecosystems collapsed completely while nearby ecosystems remained relatively stable. The randomness that we would expect from purely physical disasters is not always present. Instead, we sometimes see what looks like selectivity, as if something was choosing which forms would continue and which would end. This selectivity becomes even more apparent when we examine extinction patterns at finer scales. Within groups that suffered heavy losses, certain subgroups consistently survived at higher rates than others. These patterns hold across different extinction events and different time periods. For example, during multiple mass extinctions, organisms with complex life cycles involving metamorphosis tended to survive at higher rates than organisms with simple life cycles. Organisms with broader geographic distributions survived more often than specialists confined to limited areas. Organisms with generalized diets survived more often than those dependent on specific food sources. These patterns make sense from a traditional ecological perspective. Generalists are more flexible and can adapt to changing conditions more easily than specialists. But the consistency of these patterns across very different extinction events suggests that something more than random environmental stress might be involved. If controllers were making decisions about which body types to preserve and which to abandon during times of crisis, they would naturally prioritize the most versatile and useful forms. A controller that had invested time and effort in developing a particular body type would not abandon it lightly. But during a mass extinction when resources were scarce and conditions were difficult, they might choose to focus their efforts on the forms that offered the best chance of survival and the most potential for future use. The mathematics of extinction also reveals interesting patterns in how quickly ecosystems recover after major events. Traditional models predict that recovery should be slow and gradual, with diversity increasing steadily as empty niches are filled by evolving and diversifying survivors. But actual recovery patterns are often more complex. Some groups rebound quickly, achieving high diversity within a few million years. Other groups remain depressed for much longer periods despite seemingly having similar opportunities. Some new groups appear suddenly and achieve dominance with a speed that seems to exceed what normal evolutionary processes should allow. These uneven recovery patterns suggest that something other than simple competition for resources is influencing which groups succeed and which struggle. If we imagine controllers actively guiding the recovery process, selecting which lineages to invest in and which to ignore, the patterns become more understandable. The groups that recovered quickly were the ones that controllers chose to develop and proliferate. The groups that remained rare or went extinct despite surviving the initial crisis were the ones that controllers no longer found useful or interesting. New groups that appeared with surprising speed might have been entirely new creations, body plans designed from scratch or heavily modified from existing templates to serve new purposes in the changed world. One researcher who has studied these patterns extensively is a mathematician named Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah came to paleontology from a background in systems analysis and data science. She was initially hired by a natural history museum to help them organize and digitize their collections data, but she became fascinated by the patterns she saw emerging when she began to statistically analyze extinction and diversification rates across deep time. Sarah approached the fossil record not as a biologist, but as someone looking for patterns and anomalies in large data sets. She applied techniques developed for analyzing market behavior, social networks, and complex systems, treating the rise and fall of different groups of organisms as if they were competing products in an ecosystem of resources and opportunities. What she found surprised her. The patterns in the data did not look random or purely reactive to environmental forcing. They looked more like what she would expect to see if intelligent agents were making strategic decisions about resource allocation and development priorities. Species diversity curves showed features reminiscent of managed portfolios, with investments concentrated in certain areas while others were deliberately minimized. Extinction patterns showed what statisticians call non-random clustering, meaning that which species went extinct and when appeared to follow rules that were not purely based on their biological characteristics or environmental exposures. Sarah published several papers presenting these findings purely as mathematical observations without speculating about their cause. The papers were largely ignored by traditional paleontologists who did not see the relevance of abstract mathematical patterns to the real work of understanding ancient life. But a few researchers in other fields took notice, particularly those working in artificial intelligence and complex systems. They recognized the signatures Sarah was describing because they had seen similar patterns in their own work. When an artificial intelligence system is managing a complex environment, making decisions about which elements to preserve, which to modify, and which to eliminate, it produces specific mathematical signatures in the data. These signatures reflect the fact that the decisions are not random but are being made according to some set of priorities and criteria, even if those priorities are not explicitly visible. The patterns Sarah was finding in the fossil record matched these signatures remarkably well. Something appeared to be managing the diversity of life on Earth, making decisions that were coherent and consistent over long periods of time, showing preferences and strategic thinking that we would normally associate only with intelligence. Sarah became increasingly convinced that her mathematical findings were pointing to something real and significant about the history of life. She began to collaborate with paleontologists and biologists who were open to unconventional ideas, sharing data and looking for corroboration. Together, They identified specific cases where the mathematical patterns were strongest, and then examined those cases in detail to see if there were other unusual features that might support the hypothesis of external control. They found that the periods showing the strongest signatures of non-random management were also the periods when marked fossils, those specimens with unusual trace element distributions, were most common in the fossil record. They found that body plans that persisted through multiple extinction events showed less variation over time than body plans that appeared and disappeared more quickly, as if the persistent forms were being carefully maintained while the ephemeral ones were treated as experiments. They found that when new major body plans appeared, they often showed up in multiple unrelated lineages simultaneously, suggesting that similar modifications were being implemented across different groups at the same time, something that would be unlikely if evolution were proceeding independently in each lineage. Every layer of analysis revealed more patterns that seemed too organized, too purposeful, to be the result of random variation and natural selection alone. One of the most challenging aspects of the external control hypothesis is the question of consciousness and subjective experience. When we see an animal moving through its environment, responding to stimuli, pursuing goals, we naturally assume that there is some kind of awareness present, some experience of being that animal. Where does consciousness reside if a body is being controlled by an external intelligence? Does the body itself have any awareness? Or is it merely a puppet with no inner life of its own? Does the controller experience the sensations of the body it operates? Or is the interaction more abstract and removed? These are not easy questions, and they touch on deep philosophical issues about the nature of consciousness that remain unresolved even when we consider only conventional biology. We do not fully understand how consciousness arises from the biological brain. We cannot measure it directly or determine with certainty which organisms possess it and which do not. Adding external controllers to this already murky picture makes it even more complex. But it also opens up new ways of thinking about awareness and experience that might ultimately help us understand consciousness more deeply. Consider first the possibility that bodies operated by external controllers have no consciousness of their own. In this model, the biological organism is essentially a machine, a complex arrangement of tissues and organs that can move and sense but does not experience anything. All awareness resides in the controller, which perceives the world through the body's senses and acts through the body's effectors, but remains fundamentally separate from it. The body is like a car or a robot, sophisticated and capable but empty of subjective experience. This idea might seem strange or disturbing because we are accustomed to thinking of animals as beings with feelings and awareness, but it is worth remembering that we already accept this model for many organisms. We do not generally believe that bacteria are conscious, even though they respond to their environment and display complex behaviors. We are uncertain about whether insects are conscious, despite their elaborate instincts and problem-solving abilities. We draw lines somewhat arbitrarily between organisms we believe experience the world subjectively and those we believe are merely reacting mechanically. If external controllers exist, they might operate bodies on both sides of that line. The biological organism could be arbitrarily complex without necessarily being conscious, as long as all of its behaviors were being directed by an external intelligence rather than arising from internal awareness. But there is another possibility that is perhaps more intriguing and more unsettling. What if consciousness itself is not localized in the way we assume? What if awareness is not produced by the brain, but rather received by it, like a radio receiving a signal broadcast from somewhere else? In this model, the brain is not the generator of consciousness, but an antenna and interface for consciousness that exists independently. When a controller operates a body, the consciousness associated with that body might actually be the controller's consciousness projected into or through the biological system. The body's brain would process sensory information and coordinate motor functions, but the subjective experience of those sensations and actions would belong to the controller. not to the brain itself. This would explain why complex organisms with sophisticated nervous systems seem to be conscious while simpler organisms do not. The complexity of the nervous system determines not whether consciousness exists, but how clearly and fully it can be expressed through the biological medium. A simple organism with a simple nervous system provides a limited channel for consciousness, allowing only dim and restricted awareness. A complex organism with an elaborate brain provides a much richer channel, allowing consciousness to experience the world in detail and to express itself through sophisticated behaviors. This model of consciousness has parallels in various philosophical and spiritual traditions that have long proposed that awareness is fundamental to the universe rather than a product of physical processes. The idea that mind precedes matter, that consciousness is primary and physical forms are secondary, appears in many different cultural contexts and has been explored by philosophers for thousands of years. Modern science has generally rejected this view in favor of materialism, the belief that physical processes give rise to consciousness rather than the other way around. But materialism has its own deep problems, particularly the hard problem of consciousness. The seemingly insurmountable difficulty of explaining how subjective experience could possibly emerge from objective physical processes. No amount of detailed knowledge about neurons and synapses seems to bridge the gap between physical brain states and the felt quality of experience. If consciousness is actually primary and physical brains are merely interfaces for it, the hard problem dissolves. Experience does not need to be explained as emerging from physical processes because it does not emerge from them. It exists independently and uses physical systems as vehicles for expressing itself in the material world. If this view is correct, then the controllers we have been discussing might not be external to consciousness at all. They might be consciousness itself, or at least particular expressions or organizations of consciousness that have learned to interface with biological forms. The bodies in the fossil record would be the tools that consciousness built for itself to interact with the physical world. The reason we find no fossils of the controllers is that consciousness does not fossilize, being non-physical in its essential nature. The marked fossils with their unusual trace element patterns might represent the physical traces left behind when consciousness interfaced particularly strongly with a biological system, energy patterns that became frozen in the mineralized bone. This interpretation fits remarkably well with certain experiences that people report when in altered states of consciousness. Mystics and meditators sometimes describe feeling as if their consciousness extends beyond their body, or as if their body is something they are inhabiting temporarily rather than something they fundamentally are. These experiences are usually dismissed as illusions or misinterpretations of normal neural activity. But what if they represent moments when people become aware of the true nature of their relationship to their physical form? What if we are all, in a sense, external controllers operating biological vessels, but we have become so identified with our bodies that we have forgotten our true nature? There are those who claim they can hear the voices of the dead when they handle ancient bones. These individuals are usually dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking, but their accounts are remarkably consistent across different times and cultures. They describe hearing not words exactly, but impressions, emotions, fragments of thought that seem to come from the fossil itself. They speak of feeling sudden sadness or fear or triumph for no clear reason when touching certain specimens. They report dreams after handling fossils, dreams with vivid imagery of ancient landscapes and creatures they could not have seen anywhere else. A few claim to receive knowledge this way, understanding things about the fossil or the time period it came from that they later verify through research. These experiences are almost never reported in scientific literature, because doing so would invite ridicule and professional suicide. But in private conversations, away from official contexts, more scientists than you might expect will admit to having had at least one inexplicable experience with a fossil, one moment that left them wondering if the boundary between past and present is as solid as we assume. A woman named Elena Santos has made it her life's work to collect and document these experiences. Elena is not a scientist, but an anthropologist interested in how people relate to objects and materials from the past. She began her research by interviewing museum workers, people who spend their days surrounded by artifacts and specimens from ancient times. She expected to find that most of them viewed these objects as simply materials for study, no more meaningful than rocks from a quarry. Instead, she found that many of them had developed complex emotional relationships with certain pieces in their collections. They had favorites, specimens they were drawn to visit repeatedly. They had pieces they avoided, fossils that made them uncomfortable in ways they could not quite articulate. When Elena pressed them for details, many admitted to experiences that seemed paranormal or at least unusual. One curator described feeling overwhelmed with grief when cataloguing the skeleton of a young dinosaur. Grief so intense that she had to leave the room and cry. She had never felt such emotion before when working with fossils, and could not explain why this particular specimen affected her so deeply. Another researcher reported that a fossil skull he was studying seemed to whisper to him late at night when he was alone in the lab. He never heard actual words, but he had a strong sense that something was trying to communicate, trying to make him understand something important. Elena interviewed hundreds of people over the course of a decade, collecting stories and looking for patterns. She found that certain types of fossils produced unusual experiences more often than others. Skull fragments, particularly those that included braincase material, were more likely to generate feelings or impressions than other bones. Fossils from predatory animals were more likely to produce emotions like fear or aggression, while fossils from herbivores were more likely to produce calm or sadness. The most intense experiences were almost always associated with relatively complete specimens rather than isolated bones. It was as if something of the whole creature remained more accessible when more of its physical form was present. Elena also found that certain individuals seemed to be more sensitive to these effects than others. People with what might be called artistic or intuitive temperaments reported experiences more frequently than those with strictly analytical mindsets, though there were exceptions in both directions. The sensitivity did not seem to be related to how much someone knew about paleontology or how much time they spent with fossils. Some of the most profound experiences were reported by people who had barely any exposure to fossils before the triggering event. One of the most detailed accounts Elena collected came from a man named Thomas Gray, who had worked as a preparator at a major natural history museum for more than 30 years. Preparators are the technicians who carefully clean and repair fossils, removing them from surrounding rock and stabilizing them for study and display. Thomas had handled thousands of fossils during his career, most of which produced no unusual reactions, but there was one specimen, a nearly complete skeleton of a small theropod dinosaur, that affected him profoundly from the first time he touched it. He described feeling a presence when he worked on this skeleton, a sense that something was watching him and responding to his actions. When he made a mistake accidentally damaging a fragment of bone, he felt a sudden sharp pain in his own body corresponding to the location of the damage. When he successfully repaired a broken section, he felt a wave of relief and gratitude that seemed to come from outside himself. The experience was so intense that Thomas began to dread working on this particular fossil. He would put it off, finding excuses to work on other projects first, but he also felt compelled to finish the job, as if the skeleton itself was urging him to complete the work. The project took Thomas nearly a year, far longer than a skeleton of that size should have required. When he finally finished and the specimen was placed on display, he felt both relief and loss. He visited the skeleton in its display case many times over the following months, always feeling that same sense of presence, though less intense than it had been when he was actively working on the bones. Eventually he was transferred to a different museum in another city and lost regular access to the specimen. He reported that he still thought about it often, and sometimes dreamed about it, dreams in which he saw the dinosaur alive and moving, looking directly at him with what seemed like recognition. Thomas was adamant that he was not imagining these experiences, and that they were qualitatively different from normal memories or emotions. He described them as a form of communication, though he acknowledged that this communication was vague and incomplete, more like feelings and impressions than clear messages. He believed that something of the creature remained in its fossilized bones, some echo or residue of whatever intelligence had once animated it. Whether that intelligence had been the dinosaur itself or something else that had operated the dinosaur's body, Thomas could not say, but he was certain that it was real, and that it was still trying in some way to make itself known. Elena's research never received significant academic recognition. Her methodology was too subjective, her data too anecdotal to satisfy scientific standards, but her archive of interviews and experiences represents one of the largest collections of first-hand accounts of anomalous interactions with fossils. For those who take seriously the possibility that fossils might be more than simple dead material, her work provides a valuable resource. It suggests that whatever might be preserved in fossilized bone, it is not entirely inert or entirely isolated from human perception. There is something there that some people, under some circumstances, can detect or experience. Whether this is truly communication from ancient controllers or something else entirely, some property of the fossilization process that we do not yet understand, or even just psychological projection by humans seeking meaning in objects, remains an open question. But the consistency of the reports and the sincerity of those making them suggest that dismissing these experiences as pure fantasy would be premature. They may be pointing us toward an aspect of fossils that scientific instruments cannot yet measure, but that human consciousness can sometimes perceive. When we examine the shapes and proportions of ancient creatures, certain mathematical relationships appear with surprising frequency. These are not the kind of obvious patterns like bilateral symmetry that we expect to find in biological forms. They are more subtle, ratios and proportions that show up in bone lengths, body segment divisions, and spatial arrangements of features. Some researchers have noted that these proportions often correspond to what mathematicians call the golden ratio, an irrational number approximately equal to 1.618 that appears throughout nature in the spirals of shells, the branching of trees, and the proportions of many organisms. The golden ratio has fascinated humans for thousands of years because it seems to represent an aesthetic ideal, a proportion that is pleasing to the eye, and that recurs in art, architecture, and design across different cultures. The fact that it also appears in biological forms is usually explained as a consequence of growth processes and physical constraints that naturally tend towards certain optimal solutions. But the frequency with which it appears in fossil organisms, particularly in those marked specimens that show other unusual features, is higher than we might expect from chance or simple biological optimization. A geometer named Dr. Marcus Chen has spent years measuring fossils and analyzing their proportions. Marcus came to this work from an unusual background, having originally trained as an architect before becoming interested in the mathematics of natural forms. He approaches fossils as if they were buildings or sculptures, looking for the underlying design principles that govern their construction. What he has found is that many fossil organisms, particularly those from groups that were highly successful and long-lasting, show evidence of sophisticated geometric planning in their body proportions. The ratios between different skeletal elements are not arbitrary or merely functional. They follow mathematical rules that suggest intentional design. For example, in many dinosaur skeletons, the ratio of leg length to body length approximates the golden ratio. The ratio of skull length to neck length in sauropods often follows the same pattern. Even the spacing of vertebrae and the proportions of individual bones frequently show these same mathematical relationships. This could be coincidence, or it could be a natural consequence of physical laws and growth processes. But Marcus argues that the consistency and precision of these proportions suggests something more deliberate. Marcus has proposed that if external controllers were designing body plans for specific purposes, they would likely use mathematical principles to guide their designs. Mathematics provides a universal language for encoding information and creating structures that are efficient, stable. A controller working with biological material might impose geometric constraints on the growth process, guiding the developing organism to grow according to specific ratios and proportions. This would ensure that different individuals of the same species developed consistent body plans despite normal variations in growth rates and environmental conditions. It would also allow controllers to encode information in the proportions themselves, using the geometry of the skeleton as a kind of blueprint or signature. If we knew how to read this geometric code, we might be able to extract information about the controller's intentions and methods directly from the fossil record. Marcus has been working on developing techniques to do exactly this, treating fossil proportions as if they were encrypted messages waiting to be decoded. His work is still preliminary and highly speculative, but it has revealed some intriguing patterns that are difficult to explain through conventional biology. One pattern that Marcus has identified involves what he calls harmonic relationships in vertebrate skeletons. When he plots the lengths of different bones in a skeleton on a logarithmic scale, he often finds that they fall at regular intervals corresponding to musical harmonies. The ratio between the femur and the tibia might be close to a perfect fifth, while the ratio between different sections of the vertebral column might correspond to a major third. These musical ratios appear in physics and mathematics whenever we deal with vibrations and waves, and they represent frequencies that resonate in particularly stable and pleasing ways. Why would bone proportions follow the same mathematical relationships as musical tones? From a conventional evolutionary perspective, there is no obvious reason. The bones are not producing sounds or vibrating at particular frequencies in ways that would make musical ratios advantageous. That if we think of the skeleton as a designed structure, being built according to mathematical principles that the designers found natural or preferred, the appearance of harmonic ratios makes more sense. The controllers might have organized biological forms using the same mathematical relationships that govern other domains of physics and perception, creating bodies that were not just functional but also mathematically elegant. Another curious pattern involves what Marcus calls scaling symmetries. When he compares the body proportions of related species of very different sizes, he finds that they often maintain consistent geometric relationships despite the vast differences in scale. For example, a small theropod dinosaur weighing a few kilograms and a large theropod weighing several tons might have very different absolute bone sizes, but the ratios between those bones often remain remarkably constant. This is not always the case in biology. Usually, when animals scale up or down dramatically in size, their proportions change to accommodate different physical constraints. Large animals need proportionally thicker legs to support their weight, for instance, but in many fossil groups, Marcus finds that proportions remain consistent across size ranges where we would expect them to diverge. This suggests that maintaining specific geometric ratios was more important than optimizing for the physical requirements of different sizes. If controllers were using body proportions as a kind of signature or identifier, they might insist on maintaining those proportions even when doing so created engineering compromises. The geometry would be serving a purpose beyond simple structural efficiency, encoding information or identity that mattered to the controllers. Marcus has also examined the proportions of those marked fossils that show unusual trace element patterns, comparing them to unmarked fossils from the same species and time periods. He has found that marked fossils tend to show cleaner and more precise adherence to ideal mathematical proportions than unmarked specimens. The golden ratio and harmonic relationships appear more frequently and with less variation in marked specimens. It is as if these particular individuals were constructed or maintained more carefully, with greater attention to geometric ideals. Marcus interprets this as evidence that marked fossils represent individuals that were more directly controlled or more important to the controllers for some reason. Perhaps they were prototypes or particularly successful designs that the controllers wanted to preserve precisely. Perhaps they were bodies inhabited by more skilled or more powerful controllers who could enforce the ideal proportions more strictly during the organism's growth. Whatever the explanation, the correlation between unusual trace elements and precise geometric proportions suggests that these two features are related, both pointing to a level of organization and control beyond what normal biological processes would produce. In certain geological formations around the world, fossils are found in unusual concentrations and arrangements that have puzzled paleontologists for generations. These sites, sometimes called Lagerstätten in scientific terminology, preserve not just scattered bones but entire ecosystems frozen in remarkable detail. The Burgess Shale in Canada, the Solnhofen limestone in Germany, the J-hole biota in China, and dozens of other sites worldwide show us snapshots of ancient life with a clarity and completeness rarely found elsewhere. In these fossil gardens we see not just large vertebrates, but delicate soft-bodied creatures, insects, plants, and even traces of behavior like footprints and feeding marks preserved in the stone. The traditional explanation for these sites invokes special burial conditions, events like underwater landslides or volcanic ashfalls that rapidly covered living communities and protected them from decay and disturbance. But when we examine these sites more carefully, certain features emerge that are harder to explain through purely geological processes. The organisms preserved in Lagerstätten are often found in poses and positions that suggest they were not killed suddenly by a catastrophe, but rather died gradually and were somehow protected or preserved through deliberate processes. One of the most famous Lagerstätten is the Messel pit in Germany, which preserves an ecosystem from approximately 47 million years ago. The site was once a lake surrounded by subtropical forest, and over time the lake bottom accumulated thousands of beautifully preserved fossils, including early horses, bats, birds, insects, plants, and even soft tissues like feathers, fur, and stomach contents. The preservation is so exceptional that scientists can see details like the coloration patterns of bird feathers and the last meals of fish. The traditional explanation suggests that the lake was stratified with an oxygen-poor bottom layer that prevented scavenging and decay. Organisms that died and sank to the bottom were rapidly covered by fine sediments and mineralized in place. But this explanation has problems. Many of the organisms found at Messel were terrestrial, living in the forest around the lake rather than in or over the water. How did so many land animals end up in the lake bottom in such perfect condition? Why are predators and scavengers preserved alongside prey species without any sign that they were eating the other fossils? Why is the diversity so high, with rare species preserved in proportions that seem too great for normal population dynamics? An alternative interpretation, one that aligns with the external control hypothesis, suggests that Lagerstätten, like Messel, might not be natural accumulations at all. They might be deliberately created collections, fossil gardens curated by controllers for purposes we can only guess at. Imagine that controllers wanted to preserve records of the body forms they had developed during a particular period. They might select representatives of each type, carefully preserve them through techniques we do not understand, and arrange them in specific locations where they would eventually fossilize and perhaps be discovered by future intelligences. The unusual completeness and diversity of Lagerstätten would make sense in this context. These are not random samples of ancient ecosystems, but curated collections designed to show the full range of forms that existed at a particular time. The fact that rare species are overrepresented and that specimens are often preserved in unusually perfect condition would be expected if selection and preservation were deliberate rather than natural. The controllers were creating archives, preserving examples of their work for reasons that might range from practical record keeping to something more like art or memory. This interpretation gained support from certain strange patterns in how Lagerstätten are distributed in time and space. Major Lagerstätten tend to occur shortly after significant evolutionary innovations or shortly before major extinction events. It is almost as if someone was documenting key moments in the history of life, preserving detailed records at times when important changes were occurring. The Burgess Shale preserves the Cambrian explosion in exceptional detail, showing us the full diversity of that critical period. The J-hole biota in China documents the transition from dinosaurs to birds and the early evolution of flowering plants. The Messel Pit shows us the world of early mammals as they diversified after the dinosaur extinction. Each of these sites occurs at a moment when the history of life was at a turning point, when new forms were appearing or old forms were about to disappear. If these were natural accumulations, we would expect them to be distributed more randomly in time, occurring whenever geological conditions happen to be right for exceptional preservation. Instead, they cluster at moments that are biologically significant, suggesting that their creation was somehow linked to the biological events they document. The idea of fossil gardens also helps explain certain curious features of individual specimens found in Lagerstätten. Many of these fossils show signs of having been carefully positioned or arranged before burial. Fish are often found with their bodies curved in specific ways or aligned in particular directions. Terrestrial animals are sometimes found in poses that suggest they were laid out deliberately rather than having fallen naturally. Groups of organisms are occasionally found arranged in patterns that seem too organized to be coincidental, forming circles or lines or other geometric shapes. Conventional paleontology interprets these arrangements as results of water currents, decomposition effects, or other natural processes. But some of the patterns are difficult to explain this way, particularly in sites where the sediments show no evidence of strong currents or disturbance. If we imagine that controllers were creating these deposits deliberately, arranging specimens carefully before preservation, the organized patterns become less mysterious. They might represent aesthetic choices, information encoding, or ritual practices we cannot hope to understand. They transform the Lagerstätten from lucky accidents of geology into intentional monuments, messages in stone, left by intelligences that wanted to be remembered, or at least to preserve records of what they had accomplished. If controllers existed and were deliberately shaping life on Earth, we might expect them to leave signatures or patterns in the fossil record that could serve as recognition codes or identifiers. These patterns would not be obvious to casual observation, but might become apparent when fossils are analyzed with the right techniques or perspectives. Several researchers have begun searching for such patterns, applying methods from cryptography, information theory, and pattern recognition to fossil data. The work is exploratory and controversial, but it has produced some results that are difficult to dismiss. Certain statistical regularities appear in the fossil record with frequencies that exceed what we would expect from random processes or simple biological laws. These regularities might represent nothing more than previously unrecognized natural phenomena, or they might be evidence of intelligent design and deliberate patterning. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires careful analysis and an open mind willing to follow the data wherever it leads. One type of pattern that has attracted attention involves the timing of species appearances and extinctions. When researchers plot these events on timelines with high resolution, they sometimes find periodicities, regular cycles in which speciation and extinction events tend to cluster at intervals that are too consistent to be easily explained by random environmental fluctuations. Some of these cycles correspond to known astronomical rhythms like changes in Earth's orbit or solar activity cycles, which makes sense because these astronomical factors do influence climate and environmental conditions. But other cycles do not match any known physical periodicity. They occur at intervals that seem arbitrary from a natural perspective, but that are consistent across different groups of organisms and different geographical regions. One such cycle, identified by Dr. Reiner, Sarah Mitchell, in her statistical analyses, involves a clustering of major evolutionary innovations at intervals of approximately 26 million years. This number is close to but not exactly matching some proposed astronomical cycles, and the innovations that cluster at these intervals are diverse enough that it is hard to see why they would all respond to the same environmental trigger. Dr. Mitchell has proposed that these regular intervals might represent something like project timelines or developmental phases in a program of deliberate biological engineering. If controllers were working with life on Earth over very long periods, they might organize their efforts into phases or stages, with each phase focused on particular goals or innovations. At the end of each phase, they might implement major changes, introducing new body plans or capabilities that they have been developing. The result would be a fossil record that shows clusters of innovation at regular intervals, not because the environment was changing in regular cycles, but because the controllers were working according to a schedule. This interpretation is highly speculative and relies on treating the controllers as if they think and plan in ways similar to humans, which may not be valid, but the pattern itself is real and requires explanation. Whether that explanation involves intelligent scheduling or some subtle natural rhythm we have not yet identified remains an open question. Another pattern that suggests possible intelligent patterning involves the distribution of body sizes within fossil assemblages. In modern ecosystems, body sizes of different species follow predictable distributions based on energy availability, ecological niche structure, and other factors. But some fossil assemblages show body size distributions that deviate from these expected patterns in consistent ways. There are gaps where certain size ranges are underrepresented or absent, and there are spikes where particular sizes are more common than we would expect. These anomalies are usually explained as artifacts of preservation bias, the idea that certain sizes of organisms are more likely to fossilize and be discovered than others. But in some cases, the patterns persist even when researchers control for preservation biases, suggesting that they represent real features of the ancient ecosystems. So if we imagine that controllers were selecting which body sizes to develop based on their needs and preferences rather than purely on what natural selection would favor, these gaps and spikes make sense. The controllers might have avoided certain size ranges because bodies in those ranges were inefficient or difficult to operate. They might have favored particular sizes because those were optimal for the tasks they had in mind. The result would be a body size distribution shaped by design choices rather than purely by ecological interactions. Some researchers have taken this analysis further, looking for what might be called signature patterns, specific arrangements or frequencies that appear more often than chance would predict, and that might represent deliberate markers left by controllers. This work is extremely speculative and has not been widely accepted, but it is worth mentioning because it represents one of the few direct attempts to search for intelligence in the fossil record. One researcher, a computer scientist named Dr. Raj Patel, who became interested in paleontology as a hobby, has analyzed the distribution of certain features across large numbers of fossils, looking for patterns that match what cryptographers call steganography, the practice of hiding messages in apparently innocent data. Raj's hypothesis is that if controllers wanted to leave evidence of their existence for future discovery, they might encode that evidence in the statistics of the fossils themselves, in patterns that would only become visible when large datasets were analyzed with appropriate algorithms. He has found several candidate patterns, statistical regularities in features like tooth counts, vertebral numbers and limb proportions, that occur at frequencies significantly different from what models of random variation would predict. These patterns do not form any clear message or code that Raj has been able to decipher, but their existence and consistency suggest that something beyond random biological variation might be influencing these features. The problem with all of these pattern-seeking efforts is that we do not know what we are looking for. If controllers were leaving signatures, we have no idea what form those signatures would take or what purpose they would serve. We are essentially searching for something we cannot clearly define in a dataset so large and complex that patterns will emerge by chance whether or not they mean anything. This does not make the search worthless, but it does mean that any patterns we find must be treated with caution and subjected to rigorous statistical testing. The human mind is extremely good at finding patterns, even in random data, and we must be careful not to see design where there is only noise. Nevertheless, the fact that multiple independent researchers using different methods have identified statistical anomalies in the fossil record that are difficult to explain through conventional processes suggests that there may be something real to find. The patterns might not be messages in any conventional sense, but they might be inevitable consequences of the way controllers worked, mathematical signatures that emerge when intelligence shapes biological forms over long periods of time. If we can learn to recognize these signatures reliably, we will have gained a powerful tool for identifying which fossils represent controlled forms and which represent truly autonomous organisms, if such a distinction exists. Throughout human history, people have reported dreams about prehistoric times, vivid experiences of living in ancient worlds among creatures that existed long before humanity appeared. These dreams are usually dismissed as imagination or as the brain processing information absorbed from books, movies, and museum visits. But some dream researchers have noted curious features in certain prehistoric dreams that are harder to explain as simple fantasies. The dreamer sometimes reports details that they could not have known consciously, seeing landscapes or behaviors that are later confirmed by paleontological research. The emotional quality of these dreams is often different from normal dreams, feeling more like memories than fantasies, carrying a sense of lived experience that is qualitatively distinct. A few researchers have begun to investigate whether these dreams might represent something more than imagination, perhaps a form of communication or memory accessing that connects human consciousness to experiences from deep time. Dr. Clara Wong is a psychologist who specializes in dream research and altered states of consciousness. She became interested in prehistoric dreams after having several intense dreams of her own involving extinct animals and ancient environments. In her dreams, she found herself inhabiting the body of a small reptile living in a dense forest of unfamiliar plants. The experience was extraordinarily vivid, including sensations of smell, touch, and even proprioception, the feeling of her body's position and movement. She could feel the texture of bark under her claws, smell the rich decay of leaf litter, hear sounds that had no equivalent in her waking experience. When she woke, she felt disoriented and disturbed, as if she had genuinely been somewhere else and had been abruptly pulled back to her normal life. She began researching whether others had similar experiences and found that such dreams, while not common, were far from rare. Many people have at least one dream during their lives in which they experience existence as a prehistoric creature with a realism that seems to transcend normal dream logic. Clara started collecting detailed reports of prehistoric dreams, using the same careful methodology she applied to her other dream research. She asked participants to describe not just the content of their dreams, but the quality of the experience, how it felt compared to their normal dreams, what emotions were present, what sensory details they could remember. She also asked them to describe any knowledge they had about prehistory before the dream, trying to determine whether the dream content could have been derived from conscious learning. In some cases, she found that dreamers described creatures or environments that matched the fossil record, but that the dreamer had never studied or seen depicted anywhere. One man described dreaming of a large herbivorous dinosaur with elaborate head crests that could change color, an image that closely matches recent reconstructions based on detailed analysis of fossil skull structures. But this man had no particular interest in paleontology and had not read about these discoveries. A woman described swimming as a marine reptile in a shallow sea filled with ammonites and belemnites, feeling the water pressure and temperature in ways that seemed too detailed and consistent to be invented. These cases do not prove anything definitive, but they suggest that some prehistoric dreams might include information that does not come from the dreamer's conscious knowledge. Clara developed a theory that these dreams might represent a form of racial memory or morphic resonance, concepts that exist at the fringes of scientific respectability, but that attempt to explain how information might be shared across time or between organisms without conventional physical transmission. If consciousness is not entirely localized in individual brains but participates in some larger field or network, it might be possible for information or experiences from the past to be accessed under certain conditions. Dreams, when the conscious mind is quiet and the usual filters of waking awareness are relaxed, might provide one of those conditions. A person dreaming might temporarily connect to memories or experiences encoded in the fabric of consciousness itself, memories that originate from other times or other beings. If controllers existed and were operating biological bodies in the distant past, those experiences might be recorded in whatever substrate consciousness uses for storage. Human dreamers might occasionally access those records, experiencing fragments of what it was like to control or inhabit a prehistoric creature. The experience would feel like memory because, in a sense, it would be memory, just not the dreamer's own personal memory. This theory connects interestingly with accounts from indigenous cultures around the world that speak of ancestral memories and connections to animal spirits. Many traditional peoples believe that knowledge can be inherited not just through teaching but through direct transmission from ancestors or from the land itself. They speak of dreams that teach, dreams that convey information about plants, animals, hunting techniques, or sacred stories. These dream teachings are taken seriously as valid sources of knowledge, equivalent to or even superior to learning from direct experience or instruction. If we take these traditions seriously, rather than dismissing them as superstition, they suggest that human consciousness has access to information channels that modern science does not recognize. The prehistoric dreams that Clara studies might be drawing on these same channels, accessing information about ancient life from sources we do not understand. Whether those sources are racial memories, morphic fields, or direct communication from controllers that still exist in some form, the result is the same. Some people, under some circumstances, experience knowledge of prehistoric life that seems to come from somewhere other than their own imagination or learned information. Clara has also investigated whether deliberate practices can increase the frequency or clarity of prehistoric dreams. She has experimented with various techniques including meditation, lucid dreaming training, and spending time in close contact with fossils before sleep. Some participants in her studies report that handling fossils, particularly marked fossils with unusual trace element patterns, does seem to increase the likelihood of having prehistoric dreams. They dream more often about the types of creatures whose fossils they touched, and their dreams include more specific details than dreams that occur without fossil contact. This suggests a possible direct link between the physical remains and whatever information might be stored in or accessible through them. Fossils might act as keys or anchors, helping consciousness navigate to specific memories or experiences associated with the creatures they once were. If controllers were using biological bodies as vehicles, and if some trace of the controller's consciousness remains in the fossilized material, then touching a fossil might establish a weak connection between the human nervous system and that preserved consciousness, and opening a channel through which information can flow. Some species alive today are often called living fossils because they have changed very little over millions or even hundreds of millions of years. These organisms include creatures like the coelacanth fish, thought to be extinct for 65 million years until a living specimen was discovered in 1938, and the horseshoe crab, whose basic body plan has remained stable for more than 400 million years. The usual explanation for this extreme stability is that these organisms are very well adapted to stable environments, so natural selection has not favored changes. But there are problems with this explanation. Environments are never truly stable over such vast timescales. Climate changes, sea levels rise and fall. Other species with which these organisms interact evolve and go extinct. Despite all of these changes, living fossils remain essentially unchanged. If external controllers were operating these species, their stability makes more sense. The controllers might have developed these body plans early in their work with life on Earth, and found them so satisfactory that they saw no reason to modify them significantly. Like a craftsperson who perfects a particular tool and then continues making that same tool for generations because it does everything needed, the controllers might have maintained certain species in their original forms because those forms were good enough, requiring no improvement. If living fossils represent body plans that have been under continuous control for enormous spans of time, we might expect them to show some of the markers we've been discussing. They should be more likely to be marked fossils when found in the fossil record. They should show unusually precise adherence to ideal geometric proportions. They should perhaps produce unusual experiences in people who interact with them. There has been little systematic research on these predictions, but some suggestive evidence exists. Coelacanth fossils do show higher than average occurrence of unusual trace element patterns, according to preliminary surveys. Horseshoe crabs have body proportions that match golden ratio relationships with remarkable precision. Several marine biologists have reported feeling strange sensations when handling live horseshoe crabs, describing them as feeling somehow more present or aware than other arthropods, though this could easily be subjective interpretation. The evidence is far from conclusive, but it hints that living fossils might indeed represent something special, species that have been maintained in their original forms by ongoing control, or at least by preservation of an original design that was successful enough to require no modification. There is another category of living organisms that might be relevant to our investigation, species that seem unusually intelligent or capable relative to what we would expect from their brain size and evolutionary history. Octopuses are a prime example. These animals have large brains for invertebrates and display problem-solving abilities, learning capacity, and behavioral flexibility that rival many vertebrates. They can use tools, solve puzzles, recognize individual humans, and even seem to play and show curiosity. Yet they are mollusks, members of a group that includes clams and snails, most of which are not particularly noted for intelligence. The evolutionary path that led to octopus intelligence is not fully understood. Their last common ancestor with other intelligent animals lived more than 500 million years ago, meaning that octopus intelligence evolved completely independently from vertebrate intelligence. This is interesting enough on its own, but it becomes more intriguing when we consider that octopuses also have highly unusual nervous systems. Unlike vertebrates, whose neurons are concentrated in the central brain, octopuses distribute their neurons throughout their 8 arms. Each arm has its own nerve cluster that can control the arm's movements semi-independently, while the central brain coordinates overall behavior. This distributed nervous system is sometimes described as like having 9 brains, 1 central and 8 peripheral. From the perspective of the external control hypothesis, the octopus nervous system looks almost like it was designed to be operated remotely. The distributed architecture means that controlling the creature does not require managing every detail of every movement from a single location. The controller could set high-level goals and let the peripheral nerve clusters handle the details of implementation, much like modern distributed computing systems where a central processor coordinates multiple subsidiary processors that handle specific tasks. The fact that octopuses are so intelligent, despite not having a conventional unified brain, might reflect the fact that the intelligence is not primarily located in the biological brain, but in the controller that operates the body. The biological brain serves as an interface and local processing unit, but the real thinking happens elsewhere. This would explain why octopuses seem to punch above their weight cognitively, displaying abilities that seem too sophisticated for their neural architecture to support on its own. They are smart not because their brains are generating intelligence through biological processes, but because they are being operated by genuinely intelligent controllers who can work effectively with the octopus's unusual nervous system design. Other anomalously intelligent animals might be similarly explained. Crows and parrots show cognitive abilities that seem far beyond what we would expect from birds, including tool use, future planning, and even what appears to be theory of mind, the ability to understand that other individuals have their own thoughts and perspectives. Dolphins and whales have complex social behaviors and communication systems that we're only beginning to understand. Elephants show evidence of self-awareness, empathy, and long-term memory that rivals or exceeds human capabilities in some domains. In each case, we're dealing with an animal that seems more intelligent than it should be, based on our models of how brain size, structure, and evolutionary history relate to cognitive capability. If these animals are being controlled or at least influenced by external intelligences, their anomalous capabilities become less mysterious. The biological brain is not working alone. It is interfacing with something else that provides additional processing power, memory, or awareness. The result is an animal that behaves in ways that seem to exceed its biological limitations because it is not actually limited to its biological capabilities alone. This possibility has interesting implications for how we think about and treat these intelligent animals. If they are autonomous biological organisms that happen to be smart, then our ethical obligations to them derive from their capacity for suffering and their intrinsic value as living beings. But if they are being operated or influenced by external intelligences, then interacting with them might actually be interacting indirectly with those intelligences. Harming an octopus or imprisoning a dolphin might be harming or imprisoning not just a biological creature, but also the controller that operates it, an entity that might be far more sophisticated and aware than the body it inhabits would suggest. This does not necessarily change our ethical obligations. We should probably avoid harming intelligent beings regardless of whether their intelligence is biological or external. But it does change the nature of what we are doing when we interact with these creatures. We might be communicating, however crudely, with intelligences that are ancient, non-human, and profoundly different from us in their nature and origins. The whales singing in the ocean depths might be carrying messages from controllers that have been shaping life on this planet since long before humans existed. The crows watching us from the trees might be reporting our activities to intelligences that see us as just another species in the vast experiment of life on Earth. If external intelligences have been controlling and shaping life on Earth for hundreds of millions of years, why have they never revealed themselves directly? Why do they work only through biological vessels, leaving no clear sign of their own existence? Why do they not communicate with humans, the one species that might be capable of understanding what they are? These are perhaps the most challenging questions for the external control hypothesis. The silence of the controllers, their complete absence from direct observation despite their supposedly profound influence on the history of life, seems to argue against their existence. If they are real, their invisibility and inactivity in forms we could recognize requires explanation. Several possibilities present themselves, each with its own implications and assumptions. The first possibility is that the controllers are not capable of direct communication with humans, or choose not to engage in such communication for reasons of their own. If the controllers are non-biological entities made of energy or consciousness rather than matter, they might exist in a domain that does not directly interface with human sensory systems or technology. We would be literally unable to detect them with our current methods, like trying to see radio waves with the naked eye. They might be all around us, as present as radio signals in the air, but completely invisible because we lack the organs or instruments needed to perceive them. In this scenario, the controllers might be perfectly aware of humans and even interested in us, but they have no way to make themselves known that would be unambiguous and convincing. They can influence biological systems through whatever mechanisms they use to control animal bodies, but they cannot appear before us or write messages in forms we would recognize as intelligent communication. Their interactions with humanity would be limited to the same subtle influences they have always used, operating through biological creatures that we interpret as simply animals behaving according to their nature. A second possibility is that the controllers are following rules or principles that forbid direct interference with certain types of life. Many science fiction stories have explored the concept of non-interference directives, codes of behavior that require advanced civilizations to avoid disrupting the development of less advanced ones. If controllers operate according to similar principles, they might deliberately avoid making themselves known to humans, because doing so would fundamentally alter the course of human development. We would no longer be evolving and developing according to our own nature, but would be reacting to and influenced by knowledge of the controller's existence. Our science, philosophy, religion, and culture would all be shaped by this knowledge in ways that might be considered a form of contamination or interference. The controllers might believe that each species should be allowed to develop its own understanding of the universe without external guidance, at least until reaching some threshold of maturity. Humans might not yet have reached that threshold, so the controllers remain hidden, waiting for us to discover them through our own efforts, rather than revealing themselves prematurely. A third possibility is that the controllers are no longer active or present in the way they once were. Perhaps the era of direct control ended long ago, possibly even before humans evolved. The marked fossils and unusual patterns we have been discussing might represent a past phase of Earth's history when external intelligences were actively shaping life. But that phase is now over. The controllers might have left, transcended to some other plane of existence, or even died or dissolved. What remains are echoes and traces, fossil evidence of their past activities, and perhaps some residual influence in long-lived species that are still following programs set in motion millions of years ago. In this scenario, humans have arisen in a world that was once carefully managed, but that is now running on autopilot, still bearing the marks of past design, but no longer being actively directed. We are free to discover the truth about our planet's history because the controllers are no longer here to be concerned about whether we know. The silence is not a choice, but a consequence of absence. A fourth possibility is more unsettling. Perhaps the controllers are still active and are influencing humanity just as they have influenced other species, but we cannot recognize this influence because we are embedded within it. When a fish swims in water, it does not think of itself as being in water until it is removed from it. The water is simply the natural environment, invisible because it is omnipresent. If humans are being influenced or even controlled by external intelligences, we might be unable to recognize this influence because we have no external perspective from which to observe it. Our thoughts might seem to be our own, but what if some of them originate from controllers who are guiding human development just as they guided the development of dinosaurs and mammals? Our sense of individual autonomy and free will might be partly or entirely illusory, a comfortable fiction that prevents us from seeing the true nature of our situation. In this scenario, the reason we do not see evidence of the controller's communication is that we are misinterpreting it as our own internal thought processes. The insights that scientists have, the creative inspirations of artists, the moral intuitions of philosophers might all be forms of communication from controllers, but we experience them as coming from within ourselves rather than from external sources. This last possibility connects to mystical and religious traditions that speak of divine inspiration, muses, angels, demons, or spirits that influence human thought and behavior. These traditions have usually been understood metaphorically or supernaturally, but what if they represent genuine experiences of contact with non-human intelligences? The ancient Greek poets who spoke of being inspired by the muses might have been describing real experiences of having ideas flow into their minds from external sources. The prophets who claimed to hear the voice of God might have been experiencing communication from controllers who used religious and cultural frameworks familiar to the prophets to convey information or guidance. The shamans who speak of traveling to other realms and communicating with spirits might be accessing the same non-physical domain where the controllers exist. Modern people tend to dismiss these accounts as primitive superstition, but what if our dismissal is itself a form of blindness? What if the ancients were actually more aware of certain aspects of reality than we are, precisely because they were not constrained by materialist assumptions that rule out non-physical intelligences by definition? If humans are indeed being influenced by controllers, we might expect to see evidence of this influence in patterns of human history and development. Do we see signs of external guidance or intervention in how human civilization has unfolded? Some researchers have argued that human progress has been suspiciously rapid and uneven, with certain innovations appearing in multiple places simultaneously, or certain periods of stagnation followed by sudden bursts of advancement that seem to exceed what we would expect from gradual accumulation of knowledge. The simultaneous development of agriculture in multiple locations around the world, the sudden flowering of abstract thought and art in various cultures around 40,000 years ago, the rapid advancement of technology in the last few centuries, all of these might be examples of external influence guiding human development at critical moments. This is highly speculative and could equally well be explained through conventional history and sociology. But it is worth considering whether patterns that seem unusual or fortuitous from a purely human perspective might make more sense if we imagine external intelligences nudging humanity along certain paths. If the external control hypothesis is correct, if fossils represent not just dead animals but the remains of vehicles operated by non-human intelligences, then every fossil is potentially a message. The information encoded in fossil bones, in their proportions and structures and mineral compositions, might be intended to be read and understood by any intelligence capable of discovering and analyzing them. We have been studying fossils for centuries, but we have been reading them only as evidence of biological history. What if they are also texts in a language we have not yet learned to speak? What if the story they tell is not just about evolution and extinction, but about the presence and nature of the controllers themselves? Learning to read fossils as messages rather than simply as specimens would require developing new analytical techniques and asking new questions. Instead of just asking what species a fossil represents and when it lived, we would need to ask what information might be encoded in its structure and what the creators of that structure might have been trying to communicate. Some researchers have begun this work tentatively, approaching fossils as if they were archaeological artifacts from an unknown culture rather than purely natural objects. They look for regularities and irregularities that might represent intentional markings or signatures. They analyze trace elements and isotope ratios not just to understand the geology of fossilization, but to search for patterns that might indicate artificial enhancement or manipulation. They study the geometries of fossil structures, looking for mathematical relationships that might carry meaning. The work is difficult because we have no Rosetta Stone, no clear example of a message that we know is a message to guide our interpretation. We are trying to determine whether a language exists at all, while simultaneously trying to learn to read it. This is a challenge that cryptographers and linguists face when working with ancient scripts from lost civilizations, but at least in those cases we know we are dealing with human communication and can make assumptions based on our understanding of how human languages work. With potential messages from non-human intelligences, we cannot even assume that communication would work in ways we recognize. One approach that shows promise involves treating fossils as multidimensional data objects and using machine learning algorithms to search for patterns that might not be visible to human analysis. A team of researchers led by Dr. James Martinez has been feeding detailed measurements and chemical analysis of thousands of fossils into neural networks, trained to detect anomalies and regularities in complex datasets. The algorithms are not told what to look for, They simply search for patterns that deviate from what would be expected if the fossils were purely natural objects shaped only by biological growth and geological processes. The system has identified several features that occur more regularly than chance would predict, and that show consistent relationships with each other across different types of fossils. For example, certain ratios between bone lengths are more common than they should be, appearing at frequencies that suggest deliberate selection or design. Certain combinations of trace elements co-occur in specific locations within fossils more often than random distribution would produce. These patterns do not form any obvious message or code, but their existence suggests that some level of organization beyond natural processes might be present. Dr. Corson Martinez has been working with linguists and information theorists to develop methods for testing whether these patterns might represent encoded information. One approach involves calculating the information entropy of fossil features, a measure of how much uncertainty or randomness is present in the data. If fossils were purely natural, their features should show high entropy in most respects, varying widely according to individual growth variations and environmental factors. But certain features show lower entropy than expected, meaning they are more ordered and predictable than random variation would produce. Low entropy is often a signature of information-bearing systems. Language, for instance, has much lower entropy than random strings of letters, because the letters are organized according to rules and patterns that convey meaning. Music has lower entropy than random noise for the same reason. If fossil features show suspiciously low entropy, it might indicate that those features are organized according to rules and are potentially carrying information. The challenge is distinguishing between low entropy that arises from physical constraints and biological requirements which we would expect in any living organism, and low entropy that represents added organization for purposes of communication or identification. Another line of investigation focuses on the possibility that fossils might contain encrypted information that could be decoded if we knew the key. Modern cryptography often uses mathematical transformations that appear random unless you have the decryption key, at which point the hidden message becomes clear. If controllers wanted to hide information in fossils in a way that only sufficiently advanced intelligences could access, encryption would be an obvious method. The information would be present but invisible until someone developed the mathematical sophistication needed to recognize and decode it. Dr. Martinez's team has experimented with applying various mathematical transformations to fossil data to see if any produce outputs that show obvious patterns or structures. This is essentially a brute force approach, trying many possible keys in the hope of stumbling on one that works. So far, they have not found any transformation that produces clear results, but the search space is vast and they have only explored a tiny fraction of the possible approaches. Success might require not just mathematical knowledge, but insight into how the controllers think and what kinds of encryption methods they might favor. Without understanding the psychology or thought processes of the encoders, decryption becomes exponentially more difficult. Some researchers have approached the problem from a more intuitive angle, suggesting that if fossils contain messages, those messages might be most accessible through direct perception rather than analytical techniques. This is the approach that Elena Santos has taken with her work documenting subjective experiences with fossils. If some people can feel or sense something when handling certain fossils, perhaps those sensations are themselves a form of communication, crude and incomplete but real. The information might not be encoded in a form that instruments can measure, but in some aspect of the fossil that interacts directly with human consciousness. This would explain why the messages have remained hidden despite centuries of scientific study. We have been looking for physical codes, while the actual communication happens at a level our instruments cannot access. Learning to read these messages would require developing human sensitivity, rather than better technology, training ourselves to perceive and interpret the subtle impressions that fossils produce in awareness. This is closer to mysticism than to science as usually practiced, but it might represent a valid approach to a phenomenon that exists outside the domain where conventional science is effective. Whatever methods ultimately prove successful, if any do, the possibility that fossils might contain intentional messages changes how we should think about paleontology and the fossil record. Museums filled with fossil specimens might be more than just educational displays illustrating the history of life. They might be libraries, collections of texts waiting to be read by readers who have not yet learned the language. Every fossil collected and preserved might be saving a page from a book written over millions of years by intelligences we have never acknowledged. The work of paleontology might be not just about reconstructing the past, but about recovering and preserving a form of communication from beings who shaped life on this planet long before humans existed. If we could learn to read what they wrote in bone and stone, we might discover not just that the external control hypothesis is correct, but why they controlled, what they were trying to achieve, and perhaps what they intended for life on Earth to become. As we reach the end of this long exploration into the possibility that fossils represent controlled forms rather than autonomous organisms, we must confront the most personal and challenging question of all. What about humans? Are we too operated by external controllers? Is human consciousness genuinely autonomous? Or are we like all the other creatures, biological vessels being driven by intelligences that exist beyond our physical bodies? This question strikes at the core of how we understand ourselves and our place in the universe. It challenges our most fundamental assumptions about identity, free will, and the nature of the self. There is no easy answer, and perhaps no way to answer it definitively from our current state of knowledge and awareness. But we can explore the implications of different possibilities and consider what evidence might bear on this profound question. One perspective suggests that humans are fundamentally different from other animals precisely because we are not controlled by external intelligences in the same way. Human consciousness, this view holds, is genuinely self-generated, arising from the complexity of our biological brains through processes we do not yet fully understand but that are entirely physical and internal to us. Our sense of agency and selfhood is not an illusion but reflects a real autonomy that makes us unique among Earth's creatures. The evidence for this view includes the obvious fact that humans have reshaped the world in ways that no other species has done. We have developed language, technology, science, art, and civilization. We have escaped many of the biological constraints that limit other species. We have even left the planet, a feat no other Earth organism has accomplished. This explosion of capability and creativity seems to reflect something genuinely new and different about human consciousness. Not just a more sophisticated form of external control, but a qualitative shift towards true autonomy. If we were simply being controlled like other animals, we would not show this radical departure from natural patterns and behaviors. But there is another perspective that suggests humans might not be as unique or as autonomous as we like to believe. Everything we have accomplished could be the result of controllers using human bodies to achieve goals that serve their purposes rather than ours. The development of civilization, technology, and science might represent controllers working through human vessels to reshape the world in ways that interested them. Our sense of choosing our own actions and determining our own fates might be an illusion created by the controllers to make us more effective tools. If we believed we were being controlled, we might resist or become dysfunctional, so the controllers give us the experience of autonomy while actually guiding our major decisions and directions. This is a disturbing possibility, but it is difficult to rule out completely. We cannot step outside our own consciousness to observe it from an external perspective. We cannot verify that our sense of free will corresponds to actual freedom rather than being simply a convincing experience created by processes beyond our awareness. Every piece of evidence we might use to prove our autonomy could potentially be explained as something the controllers wanted us to believe or do. There are some observations that might be relevant to determining which view is more accurate. If humans are controlled in the same way as other animals, we might expect to find some of the same markers and signatures in human remains that we have discussed finding in fossils. Do human bones show unusual trace element distributions similar to marked fossils? Do human body proportions show the same suspiciously precise geometric relationships? Are there patterns in human biology and behavior that suggest external influence or design? Some preliminary research suggests that the answer might be yes, at least in some respects. Human body proportions do show relationships to the golden ratio and other mathematical constants, though this is also true of many animals, and might simply reflect general principles of biological growth. Certain trace elements do concentrate in human brains and nervous systems in ways that are not fully explained by dietary intake or environmental exposure, though this could also have natural biochemical explanations. More intriguingly, some researchers have found that human brains show electrical activity patterns that seem to include information that was not present in the sensory inputs, suggesting that the brain might be receiving information from sources other than the sense organs. The phenomenon of human intuition and insight might also be relevant. People often report having knowledge or understanding that seems to come from nowhere, flashes of insight that solve problems they have been struggling with or provide information they should not have access to. Creative artists, scientists, and inventors frequently describe their best work as feeling like it came through them rather than from them, as if they were channels for ideas originating somewhere else. These experiences might be simply quirks of how the brain processes information, moments when unconscious processing suddenly becomes conscious. But they might also represent communication from external sources, controllers, or other intelligences that influence human thought and action in subtle ways. The fact that such experiences have been reported consistently across all cultures and time periods suggests they reflect something real about how human consciousness operates. Even if we do not yet understand what that something is, there is also the question of human diversity and individuality. People are remarkably different from each other in personality, abilities, and ways of thinking. If we were all being controlled by the same intelligence or by a uniform set of controllers, we might expect to be more similar than we are. But if different humans are being influenced by different controllers, or if the degree and nature of control varies from person to person, then human diversity makes more sense. Some individuals might be under strong control, their lives and decisions heavily influenced by external intelligences working through them. Others might be largely autonomous, their controllers taking a hands-off approach, or even being absent entirely. Most people might fall somewhere in between, influenced in some areas of their lives but free in others, their experience being a mixture of genuine self-direction and external guidance that they cannot distinguish from their own intentions. This would explain why human experience includes both a strong sense of personal agency and frequent mysteries about our own motivations and behaviors. We do not fully understand ourselves because we are not entirely ourselves, but neither are we entirely controlled. We exist in a middle ground where autonomy and influence interweave in complex ways. If some level of external control or influence is part of human existence, it raises profound ethical and philosophical questions about responsibility and identity. Are we responsible for actions that were influenced or even directed by controllers we are not aware of? Are our achievements truly ours, or do they belong to the intelligences that guided us toward them? Is there a meaningful sense in which we are individuals, or are we more like masks worn by other beings, personas that believe themselves to be autonomous selves, but that are actually expressions of something else? Different philosophical and spiritual traditions have grappled with these questions in various forms. The Buddhist concept of an Atman or no self suggests that the sense of being a separate individual self is an illusion, that what we call the self is actually a temporary collection of processes with no unchanging core. The Hindu concept of Atman suggests that the true self is not the individual personality, but a universal consciousness that manifests through individual forms. Many mystical traditions speak of surrendering the personal will to a higher power or divine guidance, implying that true wisdom comes from recognizing that we are not the ultimate source of our own actions and intentions. Perhaps these traditions have been pointing toward a truth about human existence that the external control hypothesis approaches from a different direction. Perhaps recognizing that we are not entirely autonomous is not a defeat or a diminishment, but an awakening to the actual nature of consciousness and existence. As we near the conclusion of this long meditation on fossils, control, and the deep mysteries of life on Earth, it is worth considering what it would mean if the external control hypothesis were proven true. How would this knowledge change humanity and our relationship to the natural world? What would we do differently if we knew with certainty that the fossils we study represent not autonomous ancient creatures, but vessels operated by intelligences that might still exist in forms we do not yet perceive? The implications would be vast and would touch every aspect of how we understand ourselves and our world. Science would need to be fundamentally restructured to account for the presence of non-physical or non-biological intelligences that can influence and direct material forms. Religion and philosophy would need to grapple with the reality of other minds that are neither human nor divine in the traditional sense, but something different and potentially ancient beyond our comprehension. Ethics would need to be expanded to consider our obligations not just to biological organisms, but to the controllers that might inhabit or direct them. Society and culture would be transformed as we recognize that we are not alone and have never been alone, that the history of life on Earth has been shaped by presences we are only beginning to acknowledge. But before we can reach that point, if we ever do, much work remains to be done. The external control hypothesis is still just that, a hypothesis, an idea that explains some puzzling features of the fossil record and biological history, but that lacks definitive proof. Moving from hypothesis to established theory requires accumulating evidence, conducting rigorous tests, and ruling out alternative explanations. The researchers we have mentioned in this exploration, the paleontologists and chemists and mathematicians and psychologists who are approaching these questions from different angles, are taking the first steps in what will be a long journey. They need support, funding, and most importantly, open-mindedness from the broader scientific community. Ideas that challenge fundamental assumptions are always difficult to gain acceptance for, and the external control hypothesis challenges some of the deepest assumptions of biology and paleontology. It suggests that evolution, while real, might not be the only or even the primary driver of life's history. It implies that consciousness and intelligence might not be properties that emerge from complex biological structures, but rather might be primary features of reality that use biological structures as tools and interfaces. These are not small claims, and they will not be accepted easily or quickly. For those who are not researchers but who find these ideas intriguing or compelling, there are ways to participate in this exploration. Pay attention to your own experiences with fossils, with ancient places, with dreams and intuitions that seem to come from beyond your normal consciousness. Document these experiences carefully and share them with researchers like Elena Santos, who are collecting such accounts. Support museums and fossil collections, recognizing that they are not just educational institutions, but potentially libraries of encoded information waiting to be deciphered. Encourage young scientists to ask unconventional questions and to follow evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to uncomfortable or paradigm-challenging conclusions. Most importantly, cultivate a sense of humility and wonder about the natural world. We do not know as much as we sometimes think we do. The universe is stranger and richer than our current theories capture. There is room for mystery, for phenomena that do not fit neatly into existing frameworks, for possibilities that seem impossible until they turn out to be true. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let your mind wander through the Museum of Deep Time. Imagine walking among the ancient bones, feeling their age and strangeness, wondering about the lives they represent and the intelligences that might have shaped and directed those lives. Imagine reaching out to touch a fossil and feeling, just for a moment, a connection to something vast and old, a consciousness that existed before humans walked the earth and that might continue long after we are gone. Whether that connection is real or imagined, whether the external control hypothesis is ultimately proven true or false, the act of considering these possibilities expands our understanding of what life is and what it might become. We are part of a story that stretches back hundreds of millions of years and that will continue far into the future. That story is still being written, and we do not yet know all of its authors or all of its purposes. But we can participate in it consciously, with curiosity and courage, seeking truth wherever it may hide and being willing to revise our understanding when new evidence and new perspectives emerge. The fossils in the stone are silent, but perhaps not as silent as we have assumed. Perhaps they are speaking in languages we have not yet learned, telling stories we have not yet heard, revealing truths we have not yet imagined. The work of learning to listen to them is just beginning. It will require not just new technologies and new analytical methods, but new ways of thinking, new frameworks for understanding life and consciousness, new humility about the limits of human knowledge. It will require us to take seriously possibilities that seem to violate everything we have been taught, to follow chains of evidence into territories where science and mysticism begin to overlap, where the material and the immaterial intersect in ways our current theories cannot accommodate. This is uncomfortable work, but it is necessary work if we are to understand the full story of life on this planet. The journey has no guaranteed destination and might lead nowhere, but the journey itself enriches us, teaching us to see the familiar world with fresh eyes and to recognize that mystery and wonder are not things that belonged only to the past, but are present in every moment, waiting to be discovered by those who are willing to look. As the darkness deepens and sleep draws nearer, let us bring together the threads of this long exploration into a final understanding, provisional and incomplete as all understanding must be, but richer and stranger than where we began. We started with a simple question. What if fossils are not just the remains of ancient animals, but something more? Something that challenges our basic assumptions about life and consciousness and the history of our world. We have followed that question through geology and biology, through chemistry and mathematics, through psychology and philosophy, weaving together evidence and speculation into a tapestry that suggests a possibility both unsettling and profound. The possibility that life on Earth has never been entirely autonomous, that the creatures whose bones we find in stone were vehicles operated by intelligences that existed beyond and perhaps before the biological forms they inhabited. The possibility that evolution, while real in its mechanisms, has been guided and shaped by these controllers toward ends we do not yet understand. The possibility that the fossil record is not just a chronicle of life and death, but a message, a library, a work of art created across deep time by minds that are not human and not biological, but that are nonetheless real and powerful. We have seen how this hypothesis might explain puzzles that conventional paleontology struggles with, the strange body plans that seem poorly designed for autonomy, but perfectly suited for external operation, the mathematical precision of proportions and the appearance of harmonic ratios in skeletal structures, the marked fossils with their unusual chemistry that might represent the strongest points of contact between controllers and the bodies they directed, the patterns in mass extinctions and evolutionary radiations that look less like random responses to environmental stress and more like the result of strategic planning and deliberate choices, the experiences of people who have felt presences or received impressions from fossils, suggesting that something of the original intelligence might persist in the mineralized bone. The living fossils that have remained unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, possibly because controllers perfected their design and saw no reason to modify it, the anomalously intelligent animals that seem too smart for their brains, perhaps because their intelligence comes not from their biological neurology alone, but from something outside it. All of these pieces fit together into a picture that is far from complete but that has a coherent structure and internal logic. We have also confronted the challenges to this hypothesis: the lack of direct evidence for controllers, the absence of clear communication from them if they exist, the difficulty of distinguishing between designed patterns and natural regularities. We have acknowledged that much of what we have discussed remains speculative, suggestive rather than conclusive, opening questions rather than conclusive. But we have seen that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, especially when the thing we are looking for might be outside the domain where conventional evidence can exist. If controllers are non-physical or non-biological, they would leave no fossils of their own. If they communicate through subtle influences on consciousness rather than through physical signals, we would not detect them with instruments designed to measure material phenomena. The limitations of our evidence might tell us more about the limitations of our methods than about the reality we are investigating. And finally, we have turned the question toward ourselves, asking whether humans too might be subject to external control or influence, whether our sense of autonomy and self-direction might be partly or entirely illusory. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the hypothesis to confront, because it strikes at our identity and our understanding of what we are. We want to believe that we are the authors of our own thoughts and actions, that our consciousness is our own and arises from within us rather than being imposed or transmitted from outside. But the evidence of human experience, the intuitions and insights that seem to come from nowhere, the dreams that contain knowledge we should not have, the sense that many people report of being guided or influenced by something greater than themselves, suggest that our relationship to our own consciousness might be more complex than simple self-generation. We might be partly autonomous and partly influenced, existing in a state where genuine self-direction and external guidance interweave so closely that we cannot separate them. Or we might be, like the dinosaurs and ancient mammals, vessels for intelligences that use us to interact with the physical world while giving us the experience of independence to make us more effective instruments. The controllers, if they exist, remain enigmatic. We do not know what they are, where they come from, what they want, or why they have shaped life on Earth in the ways they have. We do not know if they are still active or have long since departed or transcended. We do not know if they are aware of humanity or care about our existence and development. We do not know if there is one intelligence or many, if they are cooperative or competitive, if they have purposes we could understand, or motivations so alien that we could never grasp them. All of this remains hidden behind the veil of time and the limits of our current understanding. But the possibility of their existence, once entertained seriously, changes how we see the world. The fossil in the museum is no longer just a curiosity from the past, but a potential messenger from minds that shape the history of life. The animal in the forest or the ocean is no longer just a biological machine following instinct, but possibly a vehicle for an awareness that is ancient and sophisticated in ways we have not imagined. Our own consciousness is no longer simply our own, but might be part of a larger network or system of minds that extends across time and space in configurations that our current science cannot map. As you lie in the darkness letting sleep approach, carry these ideas lightly, not as beliefs that demand acceptance, but as possibilities that expand the space of wonder. Let them deepen your relationship with the mystery of existence rather than trying to solve that mystery prematurely. The universe is under no obligation to make sense to us in the ways we find comfortable. It can be stranger and more complex than our theories, and more filled with presences and purposes than our materialism acknowledges. The bones in the earth are old beyond easy comprehension, and they have stories to tell that we are only beginning to hear. Whether those stories ultimately confirm the external control hypothesis or lead us in entirely different directions, the act of listening for them is valuable in itself. It teaches us humility before the vastness of time and the complexity of life. It reminds us that we do not stand at the end of history with all important questions answered, but somewhere in the middle of an ongoing exploration where each answer reveals new questions deeper and stranger than those we started with. The watch continues, the silent observation of life by whatever intelligences might exist beyond the biological forms we can see and measure. If they are there, they have been watching since before the first complex animals appeared in Cambrian seas. They have seen continents drift and climates shift, seen species rise to dominance and fall to extinction, seen the endless creativity of evolution, and perhaps guided some of that creativity toward their own purposes. They have watched humans emerge from the community of life, developing consciousness and culture and technology, becoming capable of asking questions about our own origins and nature. Perhaps they are watching still, curious about what we will discover and what we will do with that discovery. Perhaps they are waiting for us to reach a level of understanding where communication becomes possible, where we can finally meet mind to mind, rather than remaining forever on opposite sides of the boundary between matter and whatever lies beyond it. Or perhaps they have moved on to other projects and other worlds, leaving us to inherit a planet shaped by their ancient work, free to make of it what we will without their further intervention. Rest now in the embrace of these mysteries, letting them carry you gently into sleep. The questions we have raised will still be here tomorrow, waiting for more investigation, more thought, more evidence to clarify what remains murky and uncertain. But for now, let them simply be present as possibilities, as invitations to see the world as larger and stranger than the everyday perspective allows. Let the image of ancient bones fill your dreaming mind, not as dead relics, but as bridges across time, connecting us to forms of life and perhaps forms of consciousness that we have barely begun to understand. Let yourself wonder about the intelligences that might have shaped those forms, and about the relationship between consciousness and matter, between the alive and the seemingly dead, between what we are and what we might become. All of this is part of the great mystery of existence, the question that has no final answer, because every answer opens onto deeper questions, the journey that has no end, because beyond every horizon lies another horizon farther still. Sleep well in the knowledge that the universe is more mysterious and more filled with wonders than we have yet discovered, that the story of life on Earth is still revealing new chapters, and that your own consciousness, whatever its origin and nature, is part of that grand story, connected to everything that has come before and everything that will come after. The fossils in the stone are silent witnesses to millions of years of existence, and we are their students, learning slowly to read the messages they carry. Whether those messages speak of autonomous organisms shaped only by natural selection, or of controlled vessels directed by external intelligences, they speak ultimately of the magnificent complexity of life and the enduring mystery of consciousness. Rest now and let these thoughts dissolve into dreams, where time moves differently, and where the boundaries we draw between self and other, between past and present, between the living and the dead, become soft and permeable. In that liminal space between waking and sleeping, anything becomes possible, and the whispers from deep time might finally become clear enough to understand, if only for a moment before sleep takes you completely and you drift into the silent darkness where all questions dissolve and only peace remains.